Good evening. Today is January 23rd, 2023. Hard to believe that we are almost finished with the month of January, but there's an awful lot happening in our state house right now. The flurry of bills that we've seen, um, unfortunately, it's probably a lot more snow than what we're going to get here in Oklahoma tomorrow. It's hard to keep up with everything that's happening. I won't say for Oklahomans, I'll say to us by our Republican led legislature. We're going to be breaking that down for you tonight so that we can all be aware of things that we should be watching and things that we need to be reaching out to talk to our elected representatives about. All that and more on tonight's Hamilton Report. Friends, I always tell you this on Monday evenings, but it's the absolute truth. We so appreciate you spending some time with us on Monday evenings, and I hope that you will want to jump in and get involved in our conversation this evening. You can do so by leaving your comments or questions right on your screen, and we will get most of those live in our studio so that we can answer your questions and respond to your comments. It's a great way for all of us to have this very important conversation. My guest tonight has been with us on the Hamilton Report before, someone that I'm very honored to call a friend, someone who writes in a way that I can only dream of writing. He is an absolutely astute political writer, and he understands the process of what it means to be living in Oklahoma in these very challenging times. He is the editor of the Oklahoma Observer magazine, and it's my privilege to welcome back to the Hamilton Report the editor, Arnold Hamilton. Good evening, my friend. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Scott?
You know, anytime we're in a room together, we always have to clarify that we're not related by blood, but certainly by ideology.
Indeed. Absolutely.
Before we jump in, I just want to mention that the Oklahoma Observer is now beginning its 55th year. That's an extraordinary accomplishment for independent journalism. And what's interesting is the Observer was an independent voice before the whole notion of independent journalism really took hold in our country. You took over for Frosty Troy, and you and your wife, Beverly, have just done tremendous work in keeping us informed. Your online platform has really come into its own. So first, I just wanted to say, not only am I thankful that you're here, I'm thankful for the work that you do at the Oklahoma Observer, because it's invaluable to me. I look forward to it every month and read it cover to cover.
Thanks, Scott. You know, Bev and I have actually had it 16, almost 17 years now. Can you believe that? My hair was not nearly as gray, but that's what 17 years of covering the Oklahoma legislature will do to you, I think. I covered the Texas legislature for a while. I covered the California legislature, but boy, I'm telling you, the Oklahoma legislature takes the cake.
You know, that's as good a jumping off place as I can imagine. Before we start to look at the circus that convenes in a couple of weeks here in the capital city, let's talk a little bit about the last legislative session. Honestly, there was very little that excited me in a positive way out of that session, more frustration than anything else. Give me some of your highlights from last year's legislative session.
You know, I wish I had some highlights. Now perhaps, I've slept since then a few times. And so maybe I'm not, maybe I've chosen to just bury what was so awful about it. I remember we headed into the session thinking that since it was an election year, that might constrain some of the demagoguery, but unfortunately it didn't. We continued to see a legislature that majored on the minors, that continued to meddle in people's private lives. One of the things that struck me about covering the Republican takeover, which is now 12, 13 plus years old here in Oklahoma since they gained control of both houses of the legislature, is how they ran for years and years and years and claimed that an inviolate principle was the idea of local control, and instead, what we've discovered is they're only interested in local control if the locals are doing what they want them to do, and so there's a lot of meddling in local school boards and in what cities and communities can do. And the number one takeaway for me from the last session was how much money the Oklahoma legislature was sitting on, taxpayer dollars. A lot of it, really driven by two things. One, of course, there was a lot of federal money that came in as a result of the COVID.
Thank you, President Biden.
And exactly, yeah. And the other thing, Oklahoma was beginning to rebound from the slowdown from the worst days of the pandemic. And so oil and gas revenues were soaring again, how many times have we seen that movie in Oklahoma over the years? This time, you had a governor who insisted on, and legislative leadership that insisted on sitting on a lot of the money when there are dire needs that are not being met and have not been dealt with over the years. We still go back when Republicans first took control of the state house in about 2010 and imposed or carried out something that they've always dreamed of, which is income tax cuts. They'd like to do away with the personal income tax, which is the fairest tax of all. Everybody pays based on their ability to pay that way. But they want to shift the burden to the working folks here in Oklahoma. And we have not recovered from those cuts, which have been estimated at well in excess of $2 billion a year in lost revenue to this state. And we wonder why things like public education are clinging to the bottom 2 and 3 in all the ratings.
It's interesting to note that when Mary Fallon entered office, we were 17th in the nation in terms of public education. After 2 years with two terms of Fallon and 1 term of Stitt, we are now at just scraping the bottom in the country.
But allegedly, we're open for business, and we're the beacon of the world. I haven't seen too much of that yet, but
no.
And I did see a report just today. I think it was Wallet Hub, another one of their surveys, but Oklahoma was ranked, I think, the 4th worst place to retire to.
Yes.
I mean, didn't we sort of hang our hats on that for a number of years that, this is the place to be? Low taxes, low cost of living, lots of sunshine, even though we're in the dead of winter now. We had nice sunshine today, but yeah, I don't know.
but that's exactly right. We're walking around as a live tourism billboard, but when you open that book a little bit, you realize that we're paying the highest utility rates in the country now. Yep. We are still one of very few states that collects taxes on food and medication. And the jobs that are available in Oklahoma are not living wage jobs. So we can be open for business day and night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But what does that really mean if people are not wanting to come here and be able to support their family here?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think there's no better example of that than the Panasonic plant that went to the Kansas City metropolitan area. Oklahoma for years has been used to help improve the deals from other states, because people a lot of times didn't really want to come here. It isn't that they don't like Oklahoma, or they don't think Oklahoma has wonderful people, but it has to do with the fact that the education system is spotty. People are not convinced that this is where they can get their executives to move and their executives' families to move. And so, we're constantly sort of grasping at things that are real long shots. The Canute plant, for example, is one of those things. And I've been around long enough to remember when we thought MG, that MG was going to build this big manufacturing facility down by Ardmore. And of course, that never happened either, even though we spent, I think, $30 million of the taxpayers' money or some such amount at that time. So, yeah, it's not a very happy scenario. And I'll tell you what really bothers me even more about all this is we don't seem to learn our lessons. Even Kansas, when Sam Brownback went down this same road and drove them off the cliff, the voters in Kansas wised up quickly and completely revolutionized the state house and the governor's mansion, changed parties, and they've stabilized. And now they're getting things like that Panasonic plant because there's a belief that, Kansas is headed in the right direction. And you can't say that we have figured that out yet. I don't know why we are always behind. My God, we're behind Kansas.
Jacob Rosecrans, when he was appearing on Alicia's Live a couple of weeks ago, made a really good point. People did not vote for Stitt and Ryan Walters. They voted for the R.
Mm-hmm.
And so the saddest part is they told us what they were going to do to us.
Yeah,
and they were elected, and
still,
now they're doing it.
And still 52+% voted straight party Republican.
Yeah.
And some of the people who are going to be hurt the worst by this voted for Stitt and Walters. And I don't get it. I wish I understood. I love Oklahoma. Bev and I chose to come back here some years ago. We had lived in Texas for a number of years. We'd lived in California and loved both those places, but we wanted to come back to Oklahoma. This is where our roots were. This is where our families were. And, but I just can't figure out I can't figure out. First of all, we have terrible, of course, a voter participation rate in this state.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crowing about, we've had in excess of 50% who voted. And well, that doesn't begin to tell the whole story because, as you know, we are one of the lowest states in the country for people who are actually registered to vote. So, maybe that has something to do with it. And I don't think we're well served, unfortunately. We have not been well served over the years by mainstream media here in Oklahoma. I don't think a lot of people get a clear picture of what the heck's going on in this state. And of course, that's where we try with our modest publication to help explain to people what it actually means to them, what's being done to them.
And you said it, it's what's being done to us. And as long as we, as Oklahomans, remain silent and endure this punishment, nothing's going to change. And that's why this year, in our party rebuilding year, we are encouraging people now to get on the phone, to send emails to your legislators about the things that you're seeing, because it's never too early to start communicating with them. And we have to do that. We cannot afford to just settle back and wait and see how bad things will become out of this session. Speaking of this session, Arnold, and I know that you've not had a chance to go through all of the thousands of bills.
3,000 plus bills,
yeah.
Yes.
Most of which we should tell our viewers, most of which will never be heard. They'll never come out of committee. They'll simply just die. But sadly, it's the ones that are apt to cause the greatest pain to Oklahoma that will see the light of day. What are you looking at now that you're particularly concerned about for this year?
Well, there are three areas that I think I would encourage people to keep an eye on with this legislative session. First of all, involves their pocketbooks, because once again, the Republican supermajority is talking about income tax cuts. And they are tossing a bone to the notion of grocery tax, easing the grocery tax. Although it's important to note on that, that's not entirely a state tax. The state could eliminate the grocery tax, the state grocery tax. But municipalities in this state are funded by the sales tax, which is, of course, as we know, the most regressive tax there is out there. A couple of, 8, 9 cents, 10 cents on the dollar tax on a gallon of milk is not going to bother Harold Ham at all. But boy, it's, a lot of folks in Oklahoma, a lot of workaday Oklahomans, that adds up over the course of the year. So if the legislature insists on cutting the state income tax again, it is amazing to me that they are so they have such amnesia, because it was just a few years ago, of course, that we had the teacher walkout. A gun basically was held to the heads of the legislature to raise the gross production tax some. It's still not nearly as high as it needs to be. But, with Harold sitting there in the gallery glowering at the House as they passed this thing. And all those folks said at the time they never wanted to go through that thing again, but they're headed down that road again. We're sitting fat and sassy right now. Gross production tax revenues are up. We have lots of money in the rainy day fund, $4+ billion, which is criminal in my mind. There's no reason for Oklahoma to have that amount of money sitting there when you have the kinds of needs that we have, whether it's education, healthcare, whatever.
Mental health, housing for those without homes. I mean, that is an enormous amount of money.
Exactly. And we have to remember, folks, who benefits the most from income tax cuts? It's those at the top of the tier. Most workaday folks are not, they're barely going to get enough to get a couple of Big Macs and some fries from McDonald's out of this deal. But they're going to continue to see public education suffer. They're going to continue to see mental health care coverage, health care suffer, all those sorts of things that we really should be investing in to help Oklahoma become all that it can be in a much better state. So taxes are at the top of my list for things that people need to be paying attention to. Obviously, school vouchers. It is a rural school killer. The Republicans can claim all they want that it's not, but it is. There are no options out there in rural Oklahoma. If you end up siphoning more money out of public education, which is underfunded as it is, now they're playing what I think is an interesting game right now on this. You have the chair of the Senate Education Committee, who came out with much ballyhoo last week with a big plan about what he wanted to do. There's some very good things in there if he can pull it off. $241 million to increase teachers' salaries again, paid maternity leave, for teachers, the sorts of things we should have been doing all along. So the $241 million is not nearly enough, by the way, but and then you have some other John Waldron, the state representative from Tulsa, the Democrat from Tulsa, has proposed a 20% pay increase for support personnel. The folks who drive the buses, who, they cook in the cafeteria, they clean, they keep the lights on in the buildings and so forth. You do away with, if you cut the income tax again and revenues drop when we have another bust, which we will have because we're too dependent still on the carbon fuels and on ag in this state, then we're going to be right back where we were before, with barely able to keep the lights on in our schools across Oklahoma.
And we have a history of repeating the same thing over and over.
And so what's going to happen in rural Oklahoma, for example, where you don't have choices generally? Right. I guess you have a choice if you want to do a virtual learning experience. You might end up with church schools out there, perhaps. Absolutely. Further destroying the separation of church and state. And of course, the former Attorney General, Kevin Stitt's handpicked Attorney General, John O'Connor, has made the argument before he was pushed out of office that he thought it was unconstitutional to keep state public dollars out of religious institutions like that. Even though you remember it was just a few years ago, the voters overwhelmingly supported keeping a very strong, one of the nation's strongest church-state separations. So if you have that, you may not have that at all, but what's going to be left? Communities are going to empty out. The schools, they're built around their schools out there. And who's going to be left? Some maybe migrant laborers working in ag, and big ag taking over what's left of the family farms out there. How are their kids going to get educated? You're creating, to me, the potential for a whole underclass.
And rapidly, it would happen so fast. As you pointed out that in a lot of places in Oklahoma, the towns are built around the schools. In fact, in many municipalities, it's the public school system that's the largest employer.
That's right.
And when you start allowing churches to open a school in their basement, or any other organization that says, gee, I'm going to be a school today, what is that going to do to public education?
And can you imagine what's going to be taught in some of those cases? You have Ryan Walters, who wants, talk about projection. This is a guy, we need to end the wokeism in public schools. We need to do away with the indoctrination that's going on and so forth. And he's the guy who wants public school educators to be indoctrinated through the Hillsdale College history, the rewriting of American history program. And, until I think things get so bad that a lot of public schools start closing across the state. They can't keep the doors open. They can't hire teachers. We have a terrible teacher shortage because the profession has been so disrespected, and the pay is so bad, and support is so meager from our public officials. I don't, until it gets so bad that they wake up one day and say, my God, what happened to our school? We'll say, well, you voted for it.
Yeah, you sure
I hate
did.
to tell you that, and so then you have to start all over again. And I think we're risking losing at least one generation, if not more, here in Oklahoma. And for all the talk about Oklahoma being a top 10 state, there's not a prayer of that happening, I hate to say. And that, I care about that. I have 5 grandkids, and 4 of whom, all 5 of them are in public schools. The youngest one, who's 4, is in a pre-K program. And I want them to be able to grow up here, to get a first-rate education, to have opportunities. So if they want to stay in Oklahoma, they can flourish. They can be all that their creator intended. I don't want them to have to feel like, they need to leave Oklahoma.
And I understand that sentiment. I want you to take a look at this comment from one of our viewers. Sandra says, mental health support is her classroom's biggest need. She teaches 3rd graders. They're hurting. They're crying out for help. And that's with the current level of funding public education.
Well, and we've thrown a few bones. We threw a few bones last year at bolstering the counselor corps under the former state superintendent, Joy Hoffmeister. She took a lot of federal money and helped bolster that program and get things in shape to try to begin to address some of those things. It's a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, but it's a start at least. And what happened? Oh boy, you had a lot of Republican leadership just wailing and carrying on about that and saying, this is terrible. She's this locks us into something that we may not have the money for in 3 years. Well, if you don't make these investments, if you don't make it a priority, you're never going to have the money. And what we all too often see with our legislature these days is that they know the cost of everything and the value of nothing.
Very, very well put. I know that you have another commitment that you have to get to this evening, but I want to spend a moment with you talking about culture wars, because a lot of what we're seeing is punitive legislation toward the LGBT community, particularly trans individuals. But it's not limited to that. It's like any particular cultural war that they can find, they are out there doing it. And so for the party of small government, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as you pointed out earlier in this show, they're telling municipalities what they can and cannot do, school boards what they can and cannot do. How are we to deal with these culture wars that are being perpetuated and in many cases invented by the right?
Well, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were reading my notes, because that was the third major thing that I wanted to. I had three major things that I wanted people to focus on. Taxes, vouchers, and the culture wars. Because we're at least at a half dozen anti-trans bills, for example, and counting. And the meddling goes on and on. Whether it's abortion or whatever the case might be. And, it seems to me part of the problem is the way the system operates in Oklahoma these days. The extreme voices are the loudest and wield the most power in the Republican primary. So I will tell you, a lot of Republican legislators will tell you privately that they don't buy a lot of this bunk, but they're afraid of getting primaried. And so, what those of us who have a little longer term view of this and a little broader perspective, and who recognize, how important diversity is in our communities to just the overall fabric of the community, and what it means to be an Oklahoman and to be, to live in this country. I think we have to find ways to talk to people, to visit with people who may not see eye to eye with each other. I think we might agree with more than we think, but a lot of those people are sitting this stuff out and have basically thrown up their hands and set a pox on both their houses. They think, the Molotovs being lobbed have created a situation where they just don't engage in what's going on. So you're left with, unfortunately in Oklahoma right now, and what's driving the Republican stranglehold is a white Christian nationalism. I mean, it's just, there's no two ways about it. And it's allowed to flourish because that small group, they'll go vote. I don't care if you've got 6 feet of snow on the ground tomorrow. If there were an election, they would be there. And, and so, whereas so many other people are just sitting it out. I think people are beginning to, we saw it nationally this last election year, people are beginning to realize democracy is on the line. Our democratic republic, our values as a welcoming country are on the line if we allow somebody else to do our thinking for us. And so to me, it's almost, it's a little bit like Jesus, one at a time. I think we have to engage folks. And I think what we would find in many cases is that there are a lot more things that we agree on than we disagree on.
That's a perfect way to end your visit with us tonight, because I would agree with you. And I know that you're going to be very busy in February, and most of February we'll be focusing on Black Oklahomans and the good work that they're doing in our state. But long about March, I'm going to ask you to come back with an update on what we're actually seeing in real time. But thank you so much for your time this evening. Your insight is always so valuable to me, and I'm glad that you were able to share it with our viewers tonight.
Oh, thanks, Scott, for having me, and I will definitely come back in March.
All right. Enjoy that junior high basketball game.
Basketball game, yep.
All right. Thanks, my friend.
All right. Take care.
Friends, before we go, I just have to say a word about the mass killing that happened in California this weekend, on a weekend dedicated to celebration and joy and families together. A brand new year, the Lunar New Year. 11 people perished at the hands of one man with a gun. I'm not going to spend much time on this except to say it makes me so sad every time I hear of another mass shooting, senseless killings. In Oklahoma City, week after week after week, we're hearing about people being shot to death. by guns. I'm not anti-gun. I'm not anti-Second Amendment. But we've got to be serious about creating legislation that takes into account the Second Amendment, but at the same time provides safety to every single American. We'll talk more about that in an upcoming show. But for tonight, thank you for being with us. Always, always a great honor to be invited into your homes on Monday evening. And I do ask that if this has been at all interesting to you, that you consider sharing it on your social media, because we want others to gain the benefit of the insight of the guests that we bring you. And I hope that you'll consider doing that. Until next Monday night at 6:30, on behalf of all of us at the Oklahoma Democratic Party, I'm Scott J. Hamilton saying thank you and good night.